word serial killer, I'm sure you immediately envision some of the darkest, creepiest thoughts you can possibly think of. Something that you would see in a horror movie. Something like Michael Myers.
Come on now.
Or someone even more psychotic, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But is it really reasonable for the media to portray serial killers as this blatantly psychotic? Of course not. For instance, there's no way when you see this man that you would assume, oh, I bet he's killed about 17 people, he probably lures them into his apartment, chops up their bodies, and eats their organs. And I would be willing to bet quite a bit of money that no one would ever expect that this sweet, innocent-looking old lady would have killed over 10 people in her nursing home and buried their bodies in her front yard. So what is it that makes these, for the most part, average-looking men and women tick? And more importantly, what is responsible for the creation of a serial killer? Psychologists and neurologists have studied this topic for decades, and they've come up with some pretty interesting theories. A neurologist from the University of California by the name of Jim Fallon actually did a TED Talk where he discussed his theory that genetics are partially responsible for the formation of a serial killer.
It's really a very precisely timed thing. You get different kinds of psychopaths. So we're going along with this, and here's just to give you the pattern. And the pattern is that those people, every one of them I looked at who was a murderer and who was a serial killer, had damage to their orbital cortex, which is right above the eyes, the orbits, and also the anterior part of the temporal lobe. So there's this pattern that every one of them had, but they all were a little different too. They had other sorts of brain damage. The key thing is that the major violence genes is called the MAOA gene. And there's a variant of this gene that is in the normal population. Some of you have this. And it's sex-linked. It's on the X chromosome.
Fallon goes on to explain that the MAOA gene is a gene connected with the brain that correlates with the desire of thrill or high risk. Simply possessing this gene often means nothing. A certain event must occur in one's life to essentially flip the switch. The number one contributor to the creation of a serial killer is the exposure of extreme violence during adolescence. This can be anything from a parent who can't stop yelling or arguing around their kids, all the way to a physically, or in some extreme disturbing cases, a sexually abusive parent. Just because a child possesses serial killer traits does not mean that they are doomed to be a serial killer. Some of these traits include isolation, preferred independence, bizarre fantasizing, bedwetting, and an unquenchable thirst for adrenaline. However, even if a child possesses every single one of these traits, they would almost always go on to live a normal, murder-free life. Exposure to violence is the most important ingredient in the recipe for a serial killer. Most serial killers do not appear psychotic on the outside at all. They really are often intelligent, well-spoken individuals, much like Jeffrey Dahmer in his interview with Inside Edition.
Dogs, cats. I suppose it could have turned into a normal hobby like taxidermy. And all I know is that I wanted to see what the insides of these animals looked like. There may have been some violence involved, some underlying subconscious feelings of violence. It was a compulsion, became a compulsion.
Clearly, serial killers are not the monsters they are portrayed as. And I am in no way, shape, or form defending serial killers, but I think it's time that we shift our blame in a new direction. Let's take a look at some of the most infamous serial killers in America, and you'll begin to notice the trend that I am stressing. Let's begin with John Gacy, aka the clown that killed. I'm sorry if you're afraid of clowns, but this will not help your cause. He was convicted of raping and murdering 33 children. He dressed as a clown at neighborhood parties and would lure kids away who came from broken families. He is without a doubt one of the most sickening men in our nation's history. So I know you are probably assuming, well, that guy must have been a real whack job. Surprisingly not. He was actually one of the most respected men in his community. Everyone in his neighborhood claimed he was a great guy. So why would he do what he did? Well, it all goes back to childhood. He was a shy, independent kid, and of course, his dad was an alcoholic who physically abused his wife and children. Arguably the most infamous female serial killer of all time is Aileen Wournos. She brutally murdered 7 men, burying their bodies in Central Florida. Just before she was executed, she was absolutely insane, one of the craziest people you will ever see. She wasn't always this way, though. In early childhood, she was a sweet, innocent young girl. However, she was physically and sexually abused by her grandfather throughout her entire childhood, to the point where it was nearly impossible for her to go on living a normal life. Finally, we have Andre Crawford, a man who murdered 11 women and had sexual intercourse with their corpses, a practice known as necrophilia. What could possibly drive someone to do something so disturbing? Well, I'm sure you might have guessed. Crawford was sexually abused by multiple family members and other relatives throughout his childhood. The trend of serial killers who come from broken homes does not stop here. Here is a list of some of the most relevant serial killers in America, along with their history of violence and corruption during adolescence. Obviously, not every serial killer on this list comes from this background, but it is very evident that the exposure of violence throughout childhood is the #1 cause of the creation of a serial killer. I want to make it clear that I am not even slightly justifying a serial killer's actions. Murder is inexcusable. However, so is child abuse and neglect. So next time you think little Susie or Jimmy next door may be exposed to this violence, I suggest you step in and make a difference, unless you're okay with being a bystander to the formation of another psychopathic killer.